If you're bored, the thing that I have found that really helps me find that spark again is just to make the book weirder. So we wrote another book. It only took a year longer than I thought it was going to take, but hey, it's written. Hi, my name is Kris. I am a science fiction and fantasy author, and today I am gonna talk about the draft that I just finished writing. It's kind of been a while since I've done one of these. If you're new here, I have been documenting the process of writing my books on this channel for the last few years. This is the fourth book that I have finished writing. The first two books were also fantasy novels that I never published. After I would finish the first draft, I would do one of these like chatty retrospective videos where I would talk a bit about the project and what I learned from it. And I didn't really do that for Local Heavens, which was my third book that ended up becoming my debut novel, which came out in October. And that book was really a pivot from the other two books that I had written. It is science fiction. It's a queer cyberpunk reimagining of The Great Gatsby. I vlogged extensively the process of writing that book. I did so many of those writing vlogs, and then I went straight into querying the book, and then just like it was a kind of a whirlwind after that. We wrapped a fantasy book. I'm gonna talk a little bit about the book because I didn't really vlog as much the process of writing this book. I do have some writing vlogs about it. I think I wasn't really in a mental space to talk a lot about the drafting process, but I know a lot of you guys have been asking me questions. We'll get into all of that. The first thing that I want to share is a little bit more about the premise, because aside from sharing it with those of you who are Ko-fi members, I haven't actually talked at all about what the book is about. If you've been watching my videos, you know that I have nicknamed this book The Floating House. The actual title of the book is called Provenance. Whether or not that title will stay, I don't know, but that is what I have called it, and that is the title that I feel like suits the project right now. The reason that I was calling it The Floating House is because when I first came up with this idea, I was actually in conversation at the time with an agent, not my current agent, but a different agent. They had been asking about the other stuff that I was writing. I didn't have a title for this project at the time, so I had just like hastily called it The Floating House. It wasn't like a title that I was deeply, deeply in love with. That's why I was calling it The Floating House in these videos. But anyways, I'm just going to read the premise that I have. Provenance is an adult fantasy drawing loosely from the American colonial period of Filipino history, in which magic stems from traumatic memories imbued within personal effects, following the head curator of an arcane auction house and a disgraced scholar translating a dead language who must put their history aside to uncover the origin of several pre-colonial texts that are mysteriously at the center of a brewing gang war, the ambitions of the occupying government, and the auction house's enigmatic master. Soon they must examine where their allegiances lie, what it costs to wield and commodify trauma, and how, when colonialism rewrites history, uncovering a provenance might just be the strongest act of rebellion. Dark examination of magic and privilege in Blood Over Bright Haven, meditations on the relationship between colonialism and language in Babel meets the high-stakes gang politics of Jade City. There were a lot of things with writing Provenance that were very unexpected. One of the first things that really surprised me, how deeply the sophomore slump just got its claws in me. Writing that second book post-debut feels particularly hard. And obviously not all authors go through this. As I've mentioned in so many videos, I really wasn't prepared for how quickly everything with my debut was gonna go. Like when we went on sub with Local Heavens, it was very hard to write that year. I was learning how to come to terms with the fact that you can't control everything about your debut. Everything was just so new to me. And there were a lot of moments where I felt very powerless, and it was really hard for me to do all the things that I felt like I needed to do in order to get the word out about my book, while also being in this drafting mode and really protecting my creative self and my private self. The sophomore slump was hard. I definitely felt the publishing pressure. I felt the creative pressure. You know, Local Heavens and Provenance are two very different books. Obviously, they're very different in genre, but they're also very different in tone. Local Heavens is a very literary book, and Provenance is very commercial. I had never really had this experience where I was sort of working on two books at once. Local Heavens as a literary project, voice-wise and tone-wise, was so different than Provenance, and I wasn't used to this process of going back and forth between two different voices. And so when I was editing Provenance, or drafting it I should say, I could feel these like moments where I was slipping into the kind of very flowery literary voice. I think I'm a lot better now about switching back and forth between those voices because I've gotten used to it, and like I'm like slowly adjusting to what that feels like. So that is the sophomore slump. I feel like I just wanted to talk about that and get that out of the way because mental state that I was in was like so much a part of what took me so long to draft this book. And I also think that like a lot of authors, they talk about the debut experience a lot, but I feel like there's not as many people who talk about the sophomore slump. And maybe it's because like not every author goes through it. There's just something about writing book 2 that feels like a unique hell. Now that I have a draft that I can edit and fix, I kind of feel like I know what I'm doing. But when I was drafting, it was very much kind of just grappling through the darkness. Hi, it's me editing from the future. So I actually filmed this video back when I had just finished writing draft 1 of Provenance. So that was a little while ago. I am now working on draft 3. So a lot has been happening over this past little while. Now you may or may not have seen this like video that I posted where I was reacting to the first edit letter that I got back from my agent for this first draft of the book. It's so funny like watching this video back while I'm editing it months later because I was a sweet summer child. Like I did not know what I was in for. 18 pages. That was the initial edit letter that I got back from my agent on this draft. It's not that I thought after writing draft 1 that I wouldn't get back a long edit letter. Like I knew there was going to be a lot of developmental work on this draft, but 18 pages is like, it was long. Like there was a lot to do in edits. And so draft 2 was definitely a whole roller coaster. But now that I am starting draft 3 and I have kind of been talking about the editing process here and there on my other socials. After I posted that video, a lot of people were asking me, where do you even start with an edit letter like that? Honestly, the first thing that you do is you have to build up the courage to even open the document. I think it took me like 1 to 2 days to even like get around to reading it. And I had my brother read it first. And he was like, it's not even that bad. There are obviously so many moving pieces when you're writing a book, and it can be very hard to keep track of your thoughts and all of your feedback and all of your notes. But the main way that I have been staying organized, especially as I move into draft 3, is consolidating everything in Milanote. I used Milanote back when I was writing Local Heavens. I've been using it again for Provenance. If you've never used Milanote before, I have found that it's one of the best, most intuitive, all-in-one organization tools for creative projects. I am very selective about the tools that I introduce into my process, and I only like to use what I find genuinely productive and helpful. With a wide range of built-in templates to start from, it's super easy to use, adaptable, and you can even share your boards with others so you can collaborate in real time. When you're writing and editing a novel, the plot is constantly changing. You're shifting scenes around, cutting things out. So using Milanote for me has made this process just feel a lot less overwhelming because I know that I have all of my notes in one place. First, I have my dashboard, which I've organized with all of my subboards related to the project, starting with my research board, where I've gathered links and resources related to Philippine history. One thing that I really love is that Milanote has a web clipper tool, so you can save links directly to your boards from your browser, which makes the research process even faster. I also recently came back from the Philippines, where I visited Old Manila, and that setting serves as key inspiration for the book. So I took pictures while I was there, and I added that to my board so that the photos aren't just sitting in my camera roll. Next is my character map. The cast of this book is really big, and one thing I was struggling with during my first draft was keeping track of everyone who is important to the story. So this really helps me visualize the relationships, and it jogs my memory while I'm editing. Then I have my mood board and branding boards. This is where I keep any photos I find that spark inspiration and capture the aesthetic of the book. To me, I find this much more useful than things like Pinterest because I can also add audio links, videos, notes, quotes from the book, color swatches, and I can rearrange the photos in any order that I want. Inside of my inspo board is my branding board. I know that when I start making social media posts for this book, I'm going to want the fonts, colors, and visual motifs to be consistent. So I just like to have that all in one place. For the edits board, I've put my agent's comments in mini to-do lists with headers. This way it feels much more organized than just scrolling up and down a Word document, especially when the edit letters are really long. It lets me check off each edit as I go so I can can make sure that I address all of her comments. Lastly, for the subtracker board, my subtracker board is how I keep track of everything related to the actual submission process. This includes my author photo, my bio, pitch that we end up going out with, the blurb, comps, and a chart for which imprints and editors we end up submitting to. So yeah, I hope that is helpful for anyone who has been asking me how the editing process has been going and how I've been organizing my notes as I move into my next draft. If you want to try using Milanote for yourself, I highly recommend it. You can click the link in my description box and sign up for free with no time limits. Thank you to Milanote for sponsoring this video. With writing book 2, I think the other thing that added a lot of pressure for me, unlike a lot of authors who, you sell your first book and you're writing your second book on contract. For me, I am not writing Provenance on contract. Potentially no one ever reads this book. With Local Heavens, we took a long time with it before we went out with it. When you're writing a book not on contract, I think that really messed with my head a little bit, because even though I wasn't a debut author, it almost felt like I was a debut author. Especially before Local Heavens came out, I just felt like I was writing my first book all over again. That can feel like a very stagnating feeling. I wrote Local Heavens and then I started writing Provenance, and it was just like a slow freaking grind. I think the way in which I finally, I don't want to say like got over the sophomore slump, because it's still something that I'm struggling with, but I think I had to, at a lot of points throughout the drafting process, recenter myself and remind myself that, yeah, you're not writing this book on contract, and yeah, there's a possibility that it never sells or whatever, but that was also the process of what it felt like to write your first book, and you got through that. Like, you survived, you did it once, and that's sort of how I'm feeling, even though I know that there's a lot of things that I can't control about publishing. If anything, I have come out as a much more resilient person and a much more resilient writer. I always try to ground myself in the things that I can control, which is continuing to write. So whatever happens with this book, whatever amount of editing we put into it, I already know the next thing that I want to write, and that's just what I hold on to and think about. I want to share a little bit more about like the actual drafting and brainstorming. I came up with the premise for Provenance all the way back in 2023, which feels like a crazy thing to say now, because in my mind, like, I started writing the book mid 2024, because I think we were on sub with Local Heavens at the time that I was drafting this. So that was only like 2 years ago, but I actually came up with the premise for Provenance in 2023. And I distinctly remember that because I was querying Local Heavens. I had come away from the querying process feeling like, well, obviously before I got those first few offers, I was feeling like nobody wants science fiction. Nobody wants sci-fi. Nobody wants like literary cyberpunk. Nobody wants another Gatsby retelling, whatever it was. I was like, okay, I have some ideas for what kind of fantasy book I want to write. I remember the starting point was that I wanted to write about a magical auction. I had this idea for a magic system built out that was centered around personal effects. And I think I had originally developed that idea for an urban fantasy, like a contemporary urban fantasy, modern day, and it was for a completely different story. More that I thought about that magic system within a contemporary setting. I mean, I had a plot and I had ideas, but I felt like it would work really well with the auction house idea. So I ended up repurposing that magic system idea. I decided to recontextualize it within a secondary world historical fantasy. When I decided that I wanted to return to writing a world analogous with like the American colonial period of the Philippines, which is a world that I had spent a lot of time in when I was writing my second fantasy novel, I wasn't ready to leave that idea behind. I felt like there was an interesting thing to explore with the idea of personal effects, things that we pass down across generations, literally and figuratively, and what it means to commodify that. And I was also interested in the question of what gets lost and what gets changed in that process. And I felt like an auction house was a really interesting vehicle through which to explore these themes, because if you are curating for an auction, you have to know the provenance of whatever you're auctioning off. In this world where provenance is literally magic. I thought that was just like a fun idea to explore. So that was kind of the stepping stone for the entire story. I brainstormed it. I wrote an initial pitch for it, and I ended up signing with my agent. I told her about the book immediately, and she was like, sounds good. She kind of always knew that this was the next thing that I was going to write. Drafting process end to end, I want to say was about a year, but I have been calling this draft like draft one. However, so much of the book was like constantly being rewritten. Let's talk about what I liked about writing this book. So I think the first thing is a lot of things that I already mentioned thematically. I tend to get really excited about an idea when I know what my general thematic direction is going to be. That's not to say that I have it all figured out or that all of that commentary or whatever is able to be explored within a first draft, but I kind of use theme as a grounding element in the story. Otherwise, I just kind of feel like I don't know why characters are making decisions. And if I don't know why characters are making decisions, then I don't really know what I'm writing. So for me, theme is something that I can pin the characters against. They all kind of like ricochet against the theme in different ways. Like everyone has different ideologies and upbringings, and so they're going to react differently. So that's the first thing. The second thing I would say that I really enjoyed, and this is probably true for all of my books, but I really like writing character backstories. Any scene that is really internally driven, it has a lot of interiority or really unraveling who a character is. Because, you know, when you're writing, particularly within commercial SFF, you're going to have scenes that are much more action-based, much more about advancing the plot. And then you're going to have some scenes that a character backstory exposition or advancing a character relationship. And then obviously the best of scenes are scenes where you have both in parallel. I really, really like scenes that are like deep in a character's head and a lot of interiority. And you can probably tell if you've read Local Heavens, you can tell that's the way I like to write. I definitely had to pull back from that writing style quite a bit when I was writing Provenance. But when I think about what some of my favorite scenes are in the first draft, it is a lot of Ilario and Vara's interiority and their relationship. Ilario and Vara, characters that already know each other. And that's always like a dynamic that I really enjoy. It's not something that I've written in a while. If you've been around this channel for a very long time, you know that my first book was like this. I had this ensemble cast that were childhood friends that all knew each other. I kind of like missed writing that dynamic. I didn't have that dynamic for the next two books that I wrote. And so when I was planning out Provenance, I knew the way I wanted to write Ilario and Vara is that they went to the Institute together, very different social backgrounds. Vara obviously comes from an upper class family. And for her, like her academics, her role within the Institute, like that is her entire life. She almost feels like it's her destiny. And Ilario is there at the Institute for shadier reasons. And so there's this like period of time in their youth that is hinted at and explored through a couple flashbacks where they were not friends, but they were acquainted. Something happens in their past and it just completely throws their entire life off course. When they meet again within the present tense of this book, they haven't spoken to each other in years. And for Vara, it's like Ilario's public enemy number one. That sense of friction is something that I really missed writing. It's just fun to write characters who hate each other and then have to unlearn that hatred. It was a lot of just Ilario and Vara clashing and also learning to see the humanity in each other. The things that I really struggled with in this draft. Number one was the size of the cast. It's a book that's in dual POV, but we do jump into other characters' heads every once in a while, which wasn't necessarily the plan, but it was necessary when I realized how big this cast is. You know, despite the fact that the cast is big, I do try to pare it back. I don't think about all the characters as having full arcs. This is something that I talked about in my how I write my books / brainstorming video. I think of a cast of characters as like main characters, secondary characters, and tertiary characters. The only arcs that I am concerned with resolving are the main characters and the secondary characters to a lesser degree. Tertiary characters are characters that are literally plot devices. They are not really that important to the story, but they exist to aid a plot point of a secondary or main character. I think one of the things that I really struggled with in this book was figuring out who was a real secondary character and who was just a tertiary character. And I had to kind of prioritize and ask myself, like, is this an important character or am I just getting like overly attached? The other thing that I guess I struggled with was the fact that there's kind of like an entire previous generation of characters who the actions that they take 20 years prior to the start of this story, they are the catalyst for everything that happens in this book. It came to a point where I realized that having like one flashback or like just mentioning the characters passively in a few chapters was not enough, because the readers need to have context about the decisions that this previous generation of characters made and how vital it is for Alario and Vara and everything that happens in this book. The reason that the book ended up 10 to 20,000 words longer than I thought it was going to be was because I realized I needed to contextualize more of the relationships of that previous generation of characters, and the readers need to understand why they made those choices. I needed to do so much more exposition with those characters than I thought I did. And so that was a big part of why I rewrote so much of the second and third act. And it was a constant struggle, because I kept thinking to myself, is this the best way to tell the story? Like I had a lot of doubts about my structure, and I couldn't really fall back on previous techniques that I had used in other books. So a lot of that felt very new. I wasn't really used to balancing 20 side characters, you know what I mean? There were a lot of interludes that I wrote that I realized I did not need to write. The other thing that I struggled with, and this is something that I struggle with in a lot of my books, is just the order of events, like chronologically, the timeline, the things that happen, the cause and effect. I have always usually needed to spend a lot of time thinking about these things, but it was extra hard in this book because, again, there is a whole other cast of characters that is not the main cast, and the only way that I can contextualize their decisions is like in very subtle, nuanced, indirect ways. It wasn't just that I had to plan out the order of events of what is happening in the main timeline. It was like I also had to figure out what was the order of events that these characters from 20 years ago made. The last thing that I want to talk about are the lessons, the takeaways that I have from this book and what they taught me. This is my fourth time writing a book, or my fourth time finishing a manuscript, I should say. You know, sometimes when I talk about writing, I always say like, writing every new book feels like a new experience every time. I'm always constantly teaching myself how to write. And this is still true, but also just to have some positive energy. I do think that one thing that I learned while at various points while writing this book, I am a more confident writer than I think I am. I should write more fearlessly. And by fearlessly, I mean, I shouldn't be so afraid of sitting down at my desk and being faced with just crap, you know, like you open that draft, what you're reading over is really bad and you know it's really bad, but you read over it and you write through it anyway. And I think that is part of what it means to write fearlessly. You know, talent is one thing, endurance is another thing. Endurance is the thing that actually gets you anywhere. There were so many nights where I just dreaded reading over the book because I knew I wouldn't like what I was reading. And I was really stressed out about that. And there were moments where I was like, I don't know if I'm going to finish this. And the only reason that I did is because I just kind of looked at my draft. It's not the end of the world. I think that resilience and that ability to not crumble under the pressure, or to allow myself to crumble, but then to rebuild myself, that was a big lesson. You know, with my first 3 books, I could have walked away from them at any point. Like, my first 2 fantasy novels, the ones that I never published, the reason I never published them was because I just decided to walk away from. I wrote them and then I was like, I don't want to revise them. I don't want to do anything with them. I don't want them to see the light of day. With Provenance, I didn't have that. You know, I had committed to this and I had said, I'm going to write this. And that was the biggest thing that separates this book from those other books. The second thing that I took away from this drafting process, if you're bored, if you feel like you're losing the motivation, the spark for the book, the thing that I have found that really helps me find that spark again is just to make the book weirder. Like, if you're not having fun with it, just throw something in there that will make it fun for you again. And there are so many times where I will just like write a scene because I feel like I really want to explore this dynamic, or I really want to give this character just this like weird ass quirk. You know, when I'm bored in a scene, it's usually because there's something in there is just not compelling. Like there's no driving force. Characters feel really flat. They don't really feel like people. I usually just throw something in there to make a character suffer, or if I come up with a world building idea that I think is cool, I just write a scene around it, and if it sticks, it sticks. If it doesn't, it doesn't. But I do think like generally that writing advice that's like, when in doubt, put your characters through hell, make them struggle more. That really, obviously when you're editing, you can then decide whether or not it's justified, whether or not you're making your character struggle just to struggle. But a lot of times when you allow yourself to push your characters, you can usually come up with ideas. Because I think the thing ultimately that pushes people to keep reading is tension, like how well you are sustaining tension. Like if you think about what is the page turning quality of most commercial books, it's going to be the problems that you put in front of your characters and how much you can make readers care about how your characters are going to get out of those problems or how they're not going to get out of those problems. The sun just set really freaking fast. But I think that's the end of this video, so we can wrap it up here. Thank you guys for watching. Thank you for supporting the channel. Thank you for supporting my writing. And for those of you who've genuinely been excited for whatever comes next, like I said, the fate of this book, we don't know. But I'm trying to just focus on the fact that I wrote the book, and I will do everything in my power to make it the book that I want it to be. And I think that's what matters. I think sometimes once you step foot into the publishing world, all you can think about is the next book, the next sale. Throughout the process of writing this book, I have had to learn to fall back in love with it and to stop thinking about publishing and to stop thinking about who's going to like it, who's not going to like it. Like it's been a process of learning how to make this book mine again and not just something, I'm throwing out into the world. I don't know if I will be vlogging too much of the editing process. I don't know if I'll be talking much about this project from here on out. And I'm also going to be, if not today, then at some point this week, while I'm taking a break from this book, I'm going to be starting to draft the books that I have rolling around in my head. I always like to have a book that I am revising in some way and like a fresh draft that no one has read at all points in time, because I find that once a book gets pushed down the pipeline, the publishing pipeline in some way, I find that I usually need to have some kind of like secret fun project. You can follow me on all my other socials. Local Heavens is out now wherever you buy your books. That's it. Thank you for watching. I hope all your writing projects are going well, and I will see you guys in the next video.